Hi everyone, welcome to week 11. This week is divided into two parts, though they're definitely related. The first section we're going to be thinking about walking as a method, and then in the second we're going to talk about teacher as a researcher. Some of the general themes that we've been considering throughout the course and pulling them together in our final few weeks together. So this week, we're going to be beginning by revisiting some of the readings from week 10 as we consider walking as a method of inquiry. You've also have read Carly Rinaldi's Teacher as Researcher and the Curriculum as Lingering article. So this week you'll be completing your portfolio entry 8, or you'll be beginning portfolio entry 8, and that's due on the weekend of December 5th or the 6th. You can submit on either day. We'll also be beginning preparations for your final assignments, which include your final composition of the digital portfolio, which really should already be mostly done except for this last entry, and then your written paper, and then a short self-reflection of your virtual collaboratory group. And I'll go into more details of those assignments, thinking about them with you in a few minutes. But just a quick note that this week's lecture is a little bit longer because I want to give you some ideas to think within your final portfolio entry, and so you can begin thinking about your final assignments. And then next week, week 12, is our writing workshop, so it will be a little less dense. We won't have so much information to discuss. It'll be more of a time for you to work together in your virtual collaboratories and prepare for your final assignments. So this week is a bit heavier, and then next week will be lighter as you prepare your final assignments. So this week we're going to think about walking as a method of inquiry, as an artful orientation to attending to the lived experience. So last week you read an article by Triggs Irwin and Carl Lego that considers walking as an art, as a process of artistic knowledge making. So with this in mind, we'll be thinking of walking as an art practice and as an act of research in itself, considering the everyday act of walking as a creative practice. So this week, a component of your final portfolio entry will be considering walking as an artful act of research, as a way of being in the world and coming to understand it. So thinking with the dispositions that are proposed by this article by Triggs, Irwin, and Lego, you'll be considering how their processes of walking orients you to a place in which you will be walking. So with this in mind, we'll be walking and considering place as active, place as agentic and as lively, and also as full of tension, contradiction, and joy. Tuck and Mackenzie conceptualize place not as merely a neutral backdrop or a bounded concept or only a physical landscape or a backdrop to human life, but rather as a series of phenomena that are mobile, shifting over time and space, and through interactions with flows of people, other species, social practices, and materials. So there's a liveliness to place that they consider. They go on to suggest that being critically informed by the place that we're engaging with requires us to pay attention to spatialized processes of settler colonialism and extend beyond considerations of this isolated human individual existing alone to more deeply consider land, materials, more than human inhabitants and their characteristics as they determine and manifest place. So through walking and noticing materials in these places, we might reorient ourselves within the tensions of a settler colonial state by considering the that human understanding is not separate from material discursive happenings of the place in which we're situated, but rather is composed within intra-actions of humans and more than human participants. And I'm going to explain more in a minute about what I mean by material discursivity. But for now, I just want to say that in this course, we've been centering phenomenological orientations to research and pedagogy to help us orient to the livedness of experiences. And through artography, as we've discussed in the last 2 weeks, we've thought further about how this might be enacted through the arts, through artistic processes. And Maxine Greene writes that the arts enable our full engagement in and of the world, allowing us to attend and to be open to others and other possibilities. So it's sort of an embodied mode of paying attention to our tensioned implications as teachers and researchers on Indigenous lands. And we can think with the arts of noticing as an entry point to story and restory the places in which we live, to attend to places that are imbued with past present histories, and to materials which tell contested stories of how a life is lived here. So thinking with Sarah Hunt's article that we didn't have time for last week, and considering the politics of embodying a concept, that is the colonial tensions that are at play in the production of knowledge, and how as teachers and researchers, how do we situate ourselves within ongoing colonial processes, and how do we interrupt them through our knowledge-making practices, that is our methods of coming to know the world and our differential implication in it with young children. And this is always imperfect and always already an incomplete work. So as you're walking this week, think about how we might create stutters in our place encounters, as we discussed in the past weeks. What does it mean to stutter with something, to inhabit a silence or a contradiction in an encounter? Beyond a place of purity or natural beauty and childhood innocence that is so common in our field. So we can think about how we might pay attention to early childhood spaces as sites of research, as sites of knowledge production, and find ways of engaging with these spaces and these places that are accountable to colonial violences, Indigenous rights and knowledges. And Sarah Hunt asks us, quote, how can we avoid being agents of assimilation when it comes to Indigenous knowledge, people, and communities? And I think here decolonization has become a really popular term that's used to describe this work. But following Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, we can consider how there is a danger in using decolonization as a sort of grand term to encapsulate what ought to be done. The word sort of becomes normalized and overused and overgeneralized, and in some ways there's a risk here in falling into the same universalities or transcendentalism that create oppressive colonial conditions in the first place. So therefore our response, our pedagogical response, must be situated in the vulnerability of a moment where a divergent way of knowing something, however incompletely, becomes possible, and we as educators might resist that enclosure. So Sarah Hunt in her article writes, quote, one starting place might be accepting the partiality of knowledge. Its relational, alive, emergent nature means that as we come to know something, as we attempt to fix its meaning, we're always at risk of just missing something. So I think that this partiality is central in our work as teachers and researchers. If we're to challenge our appropriative and dominantly colonizing mentalities that are a result of dominant educative practices historically in Canada, then we must conceive of knowledge as never fully known or capturable. And this is also enacted in our methods, our ways of doing inquiry, our ways of creating knowledge with others. And I'm going to borrow from Fikile Numalo's work because I think it's really inspiring in terms of thinking about refiguring ourselves as educators and refiguring presences, how we come to encounter a place as a way to, what she says, creatively grapple with, interruptively respond to, as well as work through the doubts, complicated frictions, discomforts, knots, and silences that moments such as those narrated in the opening throw up in research and practice. And I think that this can be an inspiration that we hold on to as we walk this week. So following Numalo, let's think about how we might consider living inquiry and the methodological and pedagogical orientations we've been thinking within this course in seeking ways to make sense of and respond to these everyday encounters in the midst of their tensions, of their ambiguities and contradictory natures of place and of materials. So thinking in ways which implicate us not as separate from or innocent, but rather where our pedagogical orientations can live in difficult and provocative spaces, staying with the trouble as we've been talking about. And staying with the generative possibilities of holding incompatible things together. And this doesn't necessarily mean gathering and writing of moments that serve a preconceived narrative about how we believe things to be, what we already know, or illuminating moments that tell a single story that might be already familiar. Histories of settler colonialism in Canada tend to tell us, like if we attend to them in their true nature, they tell us contradictory storylines of Indigenous presences, of settler colonial structures that overlap and pull together and apart ways of being and their effects. So if we're able to attune to what is actually happening in the places that we live, we need new ways of coming to interpret them so that we can attend to that divergence and we can attend to those tensions, those fissures, those contradictions that we inherit in living in a settler colonial state. And so drawing on our readings last week from Artography, we can see these intersections and liminal spaces and overlappings as sites of intense possibility.